Well, hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. In the first article of the U.S. Bill of Rights, there is a prohibition on Congress passing any law that would restrict Americans' freedom of speech. Interestingly, that same democratic freedom makes it only into the second clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. And it kind of sums up our more ambiguous relationship with the whole concept of free speech. These days, Canadians are even reluctant to share their honest views. About a third of the population have said that. And we're also living in a time in which 48% of us feel that people who express offensive ideas should lose their jobs. And 53% think that radical ideas should be censored for the public good. So we end up self-censoring a little bit sometimes, I think, because we're fearful that we might offend or be canceled. So it all contributes to less free speech, less understanding, and that's the lens through which we are going to look at Bill 63 today, the government's latest attempt to control the content on the internet. Peter Menzies is the senior fellow, Macdonald-Laurier Institute for Public Policy, and a former vice chair of the CRTC. Peter also worked at the Calgary Herald for 16 years and was publisher and editor-in-chief, and he is writing very prolifically on this whole issue. Welcome, Peter. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you again.
I think this was your phrase, and I'm going to attribute it to you, but you've looked at this new bill as kind of the evil twin and the good twin, because there's at least two or three bills crammed into this one bill. But how do you see it overall? Is it kind of the Trojan horse, or what phrase works best for you?
Yeah, the Trojan horse analogy is one I've used. I really think that's what's happened, and it's very unfortunate because the front end of the bill, I mean, I have some problems with the construction of the Digital Safety Commission. Powers are, again, too broad, I think. But the idea of having a duty of imposing duties of care on social media companies, I think, is a practical way to go on this. It avoids the government patrolling the internet on its own, but it allows the government oversight to say, you need to behave responsibly. And I mean, a couple of years ago, Conrad von Finkenstein and I did a paper. We called it the Social Media Responsibility Act. And that duty of care approach was one we very much favored. So it'd be hard for me to oppose that, having, kind of proposed the idea ourselves. The other parts are really bad.
Okay, well, let's just set that up. So there's the Online Harms Act, and this is sort of the broad rubric here is child safety and protecting kids from all the horrible stuff that goes on online and bullying and all of that. But then underneath this evil twin, if you will, is all this other stuff, which is really restricting and defining and imposing some very strong sanctions for other activity online that doesn't have anything to do with kids.
Yeah, that's right. There's the other two. There's really two parts, but I'll call it. There's the evil part and the good part. But there's the evil part has multiple personalities. One of them is amendments to the criminal code, in terms of hate speech and that sort of thing, which would make promoting genocide, for instance, which is a really, really despicable thing to do, but just promoting it verbally, that allows for a sentence of up to life in prison, which is extreme. I mean, it's the same sentence as Robert Pickton got, right? Robert Pickton murdered how many dozens of people? To equate that is just disproportionate. And the real problem with that, I think, is by having as severe a penalty as that. I mean, you may want to signal this is how seriously we treat this, but having a penalty that severe just encourages anybody who's charged to cop a plea. Right? I mean, you're not going to take the chance. I mean, your lawyer, any good lawyer is going to tell you, plead guilty to mischief or something, and let's get out of here before you get into that.
The odd thing about this is, I guess, and it's the timing of any bill. You never know what's going to be happening at the time, although sometimes they use that as cover. But I mean, when we've got people on the streets across this country in unprecedented ways calling for death to Jews and the end of the Israeli state. And that's all happening live and in person and being republished again, both on television screens and online. Like we have some laws to deal with this kind of stuff already that we're not even using.
Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a number of laws that people could apply to that. And that even goes to the front end of online harms, where it has seven duties that it wants social media companies to oversee. And pretty much everything there is already illegal. You
Yeah.
know, sharing of intimate images, recruiting for terrorism, etc., child pornography, that's been being sold
Revenge
on the internet
porn, all of,
for
yeah,
more than 20 years, right? So, and there are charges laid. I mean, there's perception out there in some quarters that the internet has been this sort of Wild West. The law of the land has always applied to the internet. Right? I mean, you can get sued for something you say on
yeah,
the internet, just as you can get sued for something you write in a newspaper or
yeah.
stand on a street corner and shout or broadcast, right? So all of these things require policing. Whether police have an interest in policing those things is
Is
another
another.
question. If you're going to
The
download that responsibility onto Facebook, then here we are.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. What I find really curious these days, and as you've said at the beginning, you believe there needs to be some rules. You called for it yourself. We need to look at this. We need to have some rules of the road. But now we've got it always seems about offloading this, whether it was the government's other two pieces of legislation, you pay for the fact that mainstream media is dying. You pay for the fact that, hand over the money so that we can subsidize the traditional media. And now we've got things like school boards wanting to sue the internet, providers because kids are using their phones too much. I mean, at a certain point, we have to take responsibility for that as individuals and particularly as parents.
Yeah, or even school boards could take responsibility for that by saying, "Here's the basket, drop your phones in here before
Right.
class begins."
When you walk in.
In terms of that sort of stuff. I mean, there are a number of things that you want to look at, and like I said, having a duty of care is
Mhm.
appropriate. You can't have people who run and or even own individually social media companies running around behaving like Bond villains, right? And so one of the things that I thought was really disappointing was that one of the duties of care that I would have liked to have seen them impose is a duty on social media companies to defend and promote free speech. Right? It's all about
Interesting.
negative.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's sort of like the Ten Commandments. There's five thou shalt and five thou shalt nots, right?
Yeah.
And this is all shall nots in terms of that sort of stuff. Rather than saying Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, if you're going to have a set of rules, which we think you should, over what people say on your platforms, you better apply it equally to all points on the spectrum, right? Because that again can be controversial, and you have a duty to uphold objectivity in how you apply your rules and not try to shape the world the way you wish it to be.
Well, that's the
Yeah,
thing, because there are dozens, hundreds of stories of this, which is, we see it in the US more dramatically, but the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans and how they are treated with their discussion about democracy. I mean, Hillary Clinton can challenge an election, and that seems to be fine and reasonable. Donald Trump doesn't. Like, those are extreme examples, but can we actually take the politics out of it and insert fairness into it? Because it's always in the eye of the beholder.
I think there's ways to do it. Like I don't, I'm open to changing my mind, but I looked at the way New Zealand did things, and what they did was basically have the social media companies put up a code of conduct. Say, here
Mhm.
is our code of conduct. hold us to it, essentially. And that's, I think, is a good and proper role of government. Government can say, okay, prove to us that you're behaving responsibly, right? And report to us on how you're doing that, how you're applying your rules and how even they are, and be transparent and that sort of stuff. And that's one of the things that's been one of the big challenges for Meta, particularly Facebook, in recent years, is
Yeah.
transparency. But I mean, they do have 60,000 people or so patrolling their own platforms daily, taking things down and dealing with complaints and that sort of stuff. Oddly, they have, well, not oddly, but with it's not actually that surprising. But since they blocked news, they have far fewer complaints. People get
Interesting.
along. People don't fight as much, right? So
Yeah, if when you take the news posts out of there, can you, when we're talking, and I'm just going to stay on the good twin for a moment here before we really go back and focus, but in terms of dealing with issues that affect kids, I mean, in the first place, we've got have to have some definition of harms, because harms is not hurt feelings, or you said something that bugged me. Like harms has to be a serious offense of some kind.
I mean, you have to define those in terms, I
Right.
think, as much as possible. And I think, as you said earlier, there is a certain point at which we have to understand what our own personal responsibility is.
Right.
Like if people don't want their kids on Facebook until they're 16 or 14, or don't let them,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I know it'll be a battle. Anybody who's
Yes,
had
and they,
teenagers knows it's a battlefield, but whether, you were saying the kids couldn't go and see, R-rated films until they were such and such an age, it's always going to be a battle.
yeah,
But that's a big deal. But I mean, the overall goal of protecting kids is great. But I mean, a lot of that, I mean, it's positioned as this is all about children, but it's about more than children, right? It's
yeah,
about it. I don't think you're that worried that you might be worried, and maybe you should be, that your 12-year-old is being recruited into terrorism, right? Or, um, but you should be just as worried about your 32-year-old who's being recruited into terrorism.
yeah,
And the sharing of images. Actually, I think that's an actually good one, where I think the government missed something, because what it did was it included deep fakes
yeah,
into the intimate images thing, but it didn't include deep fakes into the criminal code amendments, right? Because
that's odd. Yeah,
the sharing of intimate images it's in the criminal code, right? It's already against the law,
yeah,
and virtually everything in there, to be fair, is those companies are already blocking that stuff and taking it down. There isn't really much being asked of them in that part of the bill, other than the extra wording about protecting extra measures for children that they're not already doing. So, I mean, like you said earlier, these things are already illegal, right?
mhm.
All you're doing is sort of formalizing that relationship. You're not the companies don't really have to change much. I've seen that they would have to be doing.
But if a kid is being bullied online, and let's just take that, or even in the more adult situation, there's revenge porn from a couple once intimate that has broken up. How do we go about, like, what's a realistic way to do this? Do you have to have an algorithm that picks up certain words and then a human intervention to see whether it's a good use of that word or a good use of that picture or bad? Like how can we realistically do this? We have this conversation every time governments try to control what's on the internet. How do we
Sure. I
actually
mean,
do it?
you can already complain to Facebook if somebody is bullying you on there, or harass. I mean, harassment is again, that's something in the
Yeah.
criminal code,
It's not, yeah.
right? I mean, if you're feeling like you're being harassed at that level, call the cops, right?
Yeah.
And they will take a look at it. That's one of the things you see all the time. People say on social media, well, that's hate speech. And say, well, if it's really hate speech, call the cops,
Yeah.
right?
Because
Because
that's
it's
against the
it's a
law.
it's against the law, right? It's a criminal code offense. But if it's just something you find hateful, right, something that really makes you mad, right, then block them, right? You can do that on Facebook. You can do it on X, Twitter. You can do it on anything. Instagram. I mean, the number of uh, connections that come through on my feed on Instagram that it's just block, 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 block. I'm sorry, I don't want to watch your videos, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it goes on that. So a lot of that, I think, can not all of it for sure. I don't want to leave that impression, but a lot of it can be dealt with good digital literacy skills, right? Actually sitting down with somebody when they start using these things and explaining how it works.
Yeah.
And just as parents have for generations explained to their children that if some guy drives by in a car and asks you if you want some candy and would you like a ride, you run and you run as fast as you can to the nearest house you can and knock on the door.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the message I got as a kid. That's the message I gave. But you need to do that in a digital fashion and teach your kids that. Okay, if you're a young man and with you're 13 or something, and all of a sudden some woman is making overtures to you, if
Yeah.
it sounds too good to be true, buddy, it is,
Yeah. It
right?
probably is.
You're not as hot as she's saying you are, and put your camera away.
Yeah. As you say these things, you also, I think what we're all trying to get at is the whole question of privacy too, right? I mean, that's the issue that so many of us are wrestling with online. Because there are mechanisms to deal with some of this other stuff, but the exposure that we all have by being online really, by definition, invades our privacy. And then we don't know, again, part of your education, exactly how much and what kind of data the companies are collecting and what they're using it for. Like, that's kind of a separate issue, but a really key and core one.
That's actually the big issue. I mean, we've had these three bills done by the government: the C11, the online streaming; C18, the online news, which is still an unmitigated disaster;
Yep.
and online
Agreed.
harms, which again has some good aspects but some horrifying aspects to it. What they really should have been getting to, because it really goes to the business plan of these companies, is exactly that. How do we keep control of our data? Right? Because the whole system is built on collecting user data and
Yep.
then trafficking in it, right? Selling it to each other, selling it to different companies, right? We will find you a 60 something guy who likes golf, right?
Yep.
Or who likes, to take a vacations in California and that sort of stuff. And you can
You can
design
sell
your
them shirts.
advertising, and
Yeah.
that's the effectiveness of it. But that's really our privacy. Our, our privacy laws in Canada really, that's where the focus really needs to be on that sort of stuff. And that's what gets into the TikTok thing. If you're really worried about TikTok,
Yep.
for instance, and TikTok and all the companies say that themselves, if this is what you're worried about, change your laws. We will follow your laws, right?
Yep.
And then we can get control of our data and at least know how it's being used.
Where do you come down on that issue? I mean, we're seeing the moves in the US to change the ownership structure. I mean, it's Chinese owned and controlled, and they've basically said, sell it to Americans or we're going to shut you down. Um, they've built in some safety nets on that on the Chinese. Like, what do we do? Because that goes counter to your belief in mine in free speech. Shut it off if it's bad. Don't use it if you disagree.
Yeah, well, that's where the privacy and data control laws come in, right?
Yeah.
If you impose those laws and they break those laws,
Yeah.
right, then you have an issue, because right now TikTok hasn't broken any laws.
Right.
Not that anybody has any proof of. Nobody's actually proven some of the allegations around Chinese manipulation and that. I mean, it's pretty obvious the Chinese don't have a lot of barriers when it comes to dealing with these sorts of things, and that I think goes to a big that's a big part of the problem for TikTok right now, is that lack of apparent barriers on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. So the best way to do that again is to deal with it with privacy and data. So you could say, hey, the data, you could do whatever you want with the law to a certain extent, and the companies can decide to live with it or not. But you can say, hey, that data doesn't leave the country. Whatever you collect doesn't
Well,
leave
they
the
say
country,
that
for
they are
instance.
actually holding the data in America, but that was, I mean, the horse is long out of the barn on that issue.
Sure, and I mean, there's other companies too that, the eyebrows have been raised about how you market your data, right? Facebook's come up with
Yeah,
that sort of stuff, and for all, I mean, there's a number of different platforms, all of which, I mean, this is a global issue, right? Everybody's selling data to each other all over the place. TikTok is completely banned in India, for
yeah,
instance, for um, and that's an example that you might not want to follow. Australia's taken a look at it and said they don't have any plans to ban TikTok, but then they may, and I don't know this one way or another, have better privacy legislation. But I
yeah.
think if you can deal with those things through those sorts of mechanisms rather than, I mean, the American thing right now is rather clumsy.
Yeah, it's clumsy. It does raise this whole issue though, and we saw it in the discussion around the online news bill, which is these are global entities, and we're all trying to impose, the governments are trying to impose their domestic laws on this, that, there's going to be an internet that is somehow functions under this set of rules in Canada, and then there's going to be an internet that functions under these set of rules in America. It seems naive at best, but also, I think, frustratingly impossible.
Yeah, I mean, there's possible and there's impossible. I mean, the companies adjust themselves to whatever country they're operating in, right? So they have to do that. I think something like the digital tax is a good example of where people looked at it and said, okay, wait a second, uh, how do we tax Google in Canada,
Right.
right? We can't just have these big American companies coming in and taking billions and billions of dollars out of our economy and not leaving anything behind. Everybody agrees with that. Whether
Yeah.
you're Portugal or Canada or Scotland or Norway or India, you got to find a way to do that. But where that's bogged down a little, and it will come through, and I think it'll be backdated to 2022 when it comes in, is you get an international agreement and says this is what the tax will be, right? And that allows you to do that. And I think you're probably going to see as we go forward more and more international agreements regarding how social media companies conduct themselves in
Yeah.
terms of that sort of
On that
censorship.
level, and contributing money is one thing, but having a specific program that says you have to, commit to the Canadian News Fund, or, you have to answer to these specific concerns because we think this issue is important, even though others I mean, I'm just looking at, the Florida laws are being challenged. I mean, even Beverly McLaughlin, the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said Bill 63 will likely be challenged. We've got people like Margaret Atwood in Canada saying, come on, give your head a shake. Like there's a lot of resistance to this kind of piecemeal approach to solving this, enemy that we think is out there.
Well, as there should be. I mean, we freedom of speech is journalism. Journalists have been saying for a couple of years that they are the foundation of democracy and can't exist without them, which is utter nonsense. I mean, all kinds of horrible countries still have journalists and
Right.
journalism, but freedom of speech is the foundation, right? So that's something that you mess with, I think, at your peril, because people's freedom to speak their mind is really the main cornerstone upon which democracy is built. That doesn't mean there aren't consequences,
Right.
social consequences, civil consequences, and others. Ask, I don't know, Alex Jones, right?
Hmm.
Where, I mean, there's no country that is firmer on freedom of speech than the United States of America. I mean, I went to an American high school. All my American friends, they look at Canada with this sort of stuff, and they're like, "What? You're doing
Yeah.
what? You can't do that." Right? These things are sacred
Yeah.
in terms of their. But that doesn't mean you can say anything you want and not bear responsibility for it, right? I mean, if you want to do like some of those guys do and use your media to say all kinds of irresponsible and socially damaging things, guess what? Somebody's going to sue you back to the Stone Age,
Yeah.
right? And all of a sudden there's $1 billion judgment against you, which you can never pay, but you will be financially crippled for the rest of your life and shamed. So, and then there's social exclusion that happens too, right?
Yeah. But the internet has been uh, such an important source of alternate information. Yes, of course, there are conspiracy theories, but with the mainstream media being so tied to governments of the day, both in US and here. I mean, in our case in Canada, they're literally funded, by tax dollars. So you don't see a lot of light necessarily between governments. In fact, we just heard at the foreign interference inquiry that, when there was ill-considered information about the prime minister online, they approached the company and asked them to take it down, and they did. So, they can do it when it's sort of personal, but the other side is you can read an awful lot of things that you wouldn't get any other way, and we've got to be able to protect that. But as you say, give people some tools to deal with the stuff that isn't just an alternate opinion, but maybe hate or dangerous or conspiracy.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the big challenges I mean, I just started a Substack and I wrote on that.
Yeah,
I just posted it today with in terms of that is we all know now what's not getting on your broadcast or in your newspaper, right? Because the internet allows us access to that.
yeah,
And that's a very good thing, right? I mean, it's something media have to manage in terms of their choices, but you know, the old constraints that existed around legacy media, like we only have so much airtime, right? We
right.
only have a 2 minute newscast at the top and the bottom of the hour if you're radio, or we only have, we only average, 64 pages. Like those were the happy days, right?
Yes,
And there's only so much space in our newspaper, so we have to make decisions. You know, your your space is constrained, on your website and that sort of stuff, but you don't have the same excuses for leaving things out. And you need to
right.
be aware of what's out there that you're not getting in or that you want to cover. Maybe just throw a paragraph in something. But otherwise, people are saying, hey, how come, why aren't you covering this? Right? Is it because the government's giving you money? Is that why? Right? And you're stuck trying to explain yourself constantly. So those are real challenges, I think, in the modern media environment because the internet has opened us up to not just what's happening in our own communities and our country, but the whole world. You know,
Yeah.
I can just go in there and go into the search tool and Australia latest news, and there it is. Right? I don't have to depend on anybody else to do it.
Thinking of that the other day, wasn't there a story that is it Meta that has just decided not to do any more news deals with publishers in Australia? What we heard here is real fears about what the Online News Act was going to lead to.
Yeah, I mean, just for background there, like the Online News Act was all based on the premise that the social media, like Google and Facebook in particular, really just them, were
Yeah,
making loads and loads of money off using people's news stories because it was wildly popular, right? Since they've cut off news in Canada as a result of
yeah,
C18, their stock has gone up by like 60% in the last 6 months. Not, I mean, there's other factors but I think part of that is people now have a clear idea that Facebook isn't really interested in news. So what they've done in Australia is they've said, those deals we did in 2021, they're done. We're not going to do that anymore. You can still post your stuff for free
yep.
on our sites, but we're not the
We're
the
not going to
news
pay
tab
you.
is well, in the news tab, the news tab is gone. And in the States, they're doing the same thing. They did the same in the UK and in, I think, Germany and France, where they actually suppress news because what they say is that people are happier on Facebook without news,
Yeah, no,
right?
you made that point. It's
Right?
really
That
it's
and
really
and that
interesting.
and that that's people will want to see pictures of your children and grandchildren and
Yeah,
and your new husband or your new wife or your, new dog or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That's what they want to see. It's a personal connection. It's not a place. If you want to fight about politics, go on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. That does seem to be the place, or X as we now call it. And we've had this discussion before, both you and I, but you and I separately and in the real world, that the at the core of all these pieces of legislation that the government is putting forward seems to be a lack of understanding. When I hear the Attorney General Varani say, the internet terrifies me, quote unquote, therefore we're going to bring the hammer down, it doesn't seem to be displaying a real understanding of sort of the nuanced world, which is the internet.
No, I think politicians have been afraid of it for quite some time, in part because they get, I mean, and we all do, we get exposed to points of view we didn't otherwise know existed, right?
Right.
And you also can't stop it. Like you used the example of the government going to Facebook and asking them to take down this post. I think it was a Lauren Gunter column from the Edmonton Sun or something. And this isn't true. You must take it down. Facebook said no. We're not going to do that in terms of that sort of stuff. But you see the instinct, right? You can't control it because, I mean, from back in my newspaper days, and I expect you remember from your television career, if it wasn't uncommon for politicians to pick up the phone and give the publisher a call,
Right.
or the news organization a call and say and vent, and say, hey, that was wrong. You guys completely messed it up and that sort of stuff. It gave them a sense of control
Yeah.
that they could have some influence. That's okay. I talked to Menzies. He understands. He's going to go talk to the newsroom, blah, 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 or whatever he's going to do and try to sort it out, right? Like, and there'll be a follow up that gives our side, or we can,
Yeah.
give you an example. I mean, the Toronto Star recently, posted its column by the Weedy, and then very quickly there was a rebuttal column
Right.
posted, right? That came up on these sorts of issues in terms of online harms. That's normal. That's the world they're used to living in.
Yeah.
This one, there's so much stuff out there that they can't control it. And not to go on about this too much, but just less than 10 years ago, people were treating this as being pretty exciting.
Yes.
This is what was driving the
It's
Arab Spring.
democracy. Yeah.
Look at yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. The internet is bringing democracy to the world. It's
Yeah.
taken down the government in Egypt. It's taken down the government in Tunisia. Look what's happening in Syria. It almost took down Syria. The
Yeah.
consequences were horrific, but it almost happened there. And look at Iran and that sort of stuff. And those guys running their countries were like, oh, we have to control this internet. And then what happened, I think, in North America or in the Western world, Brexit happened, and Donald Trump got elected, and everybody blamed the internet. I don't think the internet was the problem.
No, that's the thing. And I think I think Jen Gerson was writing this the other day, that you think all this digital commissioner and governments having some control of what's on there looks good if your gang is in power. But imagine if it's, Donald Trump. Imagine if it's Jordan Peterson. Like, would you like the same rules to apply when they're the ones to get to implement them? So, like, try and take the politics out of your head and look at the rules a little bit more objectively.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the big problems, one of the blind spots. I mean, I think all governments are probably susceptible to this at some point, but this government has not been good at all. I mean, it's made some of those House of Commons committee meetings. The Senate, I must say, has been much better, much less partisan, but you
Yeah,
still
I'm
get some of
trying.
it. And I mean, that's okay. It's politics, right? That
Yeah.
some of that's going to happen. But you can't treat everybody who's criticizing something and saying, if somebody actually knows what they're talking about, right? I mean, the former chair
But
of
disagrees
the,
with you. Yeah.
but just says this is a better way to do it.
Yeah.
If you do this is something bad. I believe his name is David Thomas, the former chair of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal.
Right.
came out a couple weeks ago and says this is nuts. With the Online Harms Act, 20,000 for everybody who complains, right? They can't handle the volume of complaints they're getting now. They're going to get thousands upon thousands of complaints, right? I mean, I could sit there and turn this in. I could spend my retirement just sitting there filling out Human Rights Commission
Right.
complaints about things that I think people have said that offend me and filing those complaints. And I just ka-ching, 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 right? Because I mean, the
Yeah.
commission will say to somebody, look, I mean, this guy will probably settle for 2 grand, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'll take that check,
But
right?
the cost of that, I mean, if you're going to get paid $20,000 under these rules in this bill because you're offended, but again, these bodies are global. These services are global. So is it $20,000 times everybody in the world, or just people we like, or how are we going to sort that?
Well, exactly, exactly. If you say something that offends one person,
Yeah.
that is deemed to be offensive, it deemed to be in contravention of the act, right? On X or Facebook or whatever. Um, how many does everybody who saw that qualify
Yeah.
then? Does everybody get 20 grand, right? From that? I mean, it's goofy. So it's that sort of stuff that people need to listen to and say, hey, come on,
Yeah.
right? You can't do that. It's just impractical.
Let's spend a couple of minutes on that, because you've quoted the Human Rights Tribunal, and that is one of the things where everybody has just said, whoa, 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 this is not the structure or the body to turn to for policing hate speech or any other problem speech. It's an appointed body, so it raises that whole question of who appoints them, and do you like the person who appoints the people? It was taken, hate speech was removed from this act, I think by Harper, in 2012, 2013, something, because it was a bad idea and everybody agreed it was a bad idea. So what would cause people to say, let's put it back in there when we've got all these complications that they have? And the complaints can be made anonymously. It takes 4 years to turn around a complaint in many cases at the Human Rights Tribunal. This is just a very cumbersome, awkward appointed body where you don't want them. I mean, this is why you have courts.
Yes, and that's why we have a hate speech law. And if you think
Yeah.
somebody's violated, you can take it there. Um, but I think part of the issue is people have looked at that and said, well, I can't get a conviction there. But still,
Right.
somebody has to do something about this guy. Somebody has to stop them. And as they went through when they were building the online harms, they tried it out, and then people came back and said, well, that's what North Korea does, so maybe you shouldn't do that. Or, well, this is what Iran does. That's never going to pass the charter and that sort of stuff. And they had
Right.
various backers and various groups. Most of them are most easily categorized, put into the category of what is called these days equity deserving groups, right? And when it came to online harms, some of the big backers of it in the early days were some representatives of some groups within the Muslim community who were really concerned about Islamophobia occurring.
Right.
Now online harms has come out, and you know Jewish groups have come out backing it, right? Because they want to be able to complain and they want to be able to get justice and that sort of thing. So I think with this government, it's one of the things you see consistently is that they are very available to lobby groups. If
Yeah.
you can bring a group forward that brings something, they are always looking to please. They I don't think they say no to anybody,
And they
right?
could swing
So
a couple of ridings in an election campaign.
yeah, everything's thought about with such a political lens
Yeah.
that you end up doing this, and then you do it, and you go, "Oh, that's not really working." I mean, somebody has to say at some point. I mean, there's a lot of offensive stuff, things get said, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people need to understand that this is how free speech works. You, you, you got to suck it up. You've
Yeah.
got to be willing to be offended. And you have to be, in order to speak freely, you have to understand that that might offend somebody,
And that
right?
other
You need,
people will speak freely, and that may offend you.
in response to it. Yeah, that's the whole idea. I mean, that's where manners come in, right? And I think, it really is. I mean, at the dinner table, family dinners,
Yeah,
that we don't talk politics, we don't talk about sex, we don't talk about religion, right? I mean,
right.
Christmas dinner, right out. Nobody goes there. And then drunken Uncle Fred shows up and starts talking about this and that sort of stuff, and everything goes sideways. But we have to learn. I think one of the processes we're going through right now as a society is this whole transition into digital media and social media is that we don't behave our people. Lots of people behave very poorly.
No,
We don't have the
exactly right.
sense of manners that we had
And
before.
it's
We say things that,
magnified online, right?
yeah,
Because, yeah,
and in many cases anonymous, right? So you say things to people that you would never say
yeah.
in person. You might say, "Well, I don't really agree with that," right? But all
I
of a sudden
just
it's like
find
all
the
caps
level.
and boom.
Yeah, I mean, just the misunderstanding. If you and I are having a conversation and I say to you, Peter, I think that's crazy, but I'm smiling. I mean, I'm saying that's an interesting idea, but if I say to you in a tweet, you're crazy, that idea is crazy, then you take offense, you think we're in the middle of a fight, and you respond with something else, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
yes, people do always do that thing. So you're saying I'm a racist,
right.
right? So you're saying I'm crazy? Is that what
Yeah.
you said? You're saying I'm crazy, and you go back through it. You're saying I'm ugly. You're saying did you say I'm fat? Right? Whatever you're doing, right? It
Yeah.
just goes into that, and it's honestly, it's grade 5 for
Yeah.
the most part, right?
It
Is what it
absolutely
what it
is.
de- what it devolves into. I used to say it was grade 10, but it's way worse than that. In terms of that. That said, the bad news always gets the attention,
Right.
and there's a lot of fun things about social media, right? In terms of connecting with people and meeting new people and making new friends and that sort of stuff. But we need to learn how to behave ourselves better with
So
that. And again, that goes back to digital literacy.
yeah, and the digital commissioner, and we won't get into all of the details because I'm sure we'll be back on this issue 100 times in the course of the next few months. But it seems to me that already with all of the response we've seen, as I say, from the Margaret Atwoods to the law firms to, former Supreme Court justices, everybody has a criticism and say, at the very least, you're going to have to separate these bills out because you've got kind of apples and oranges here. Like, if you want to do something about kids, try and do that, but don't throw all this other stuff in the soup.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really telling things right at this stage is that we haven't seen a charter statement from
Right.
the Department of Justice. Normally, you're going to see that fairly quickly, almost coincidental with the introduction of
Yeah.
legislation. We've scrubbed it with the charter. This is why it complies. There's no
Right.
problems here that we see. This will be compliant. We're now into the 6th week, I think, that we haven't seen it. Maybe maybe it'll come out before you wear this, but the fact of the matter that it took at least 5 weeks to come out with it, despite people asking for it, really ra- raises some questions about how hard are you guys going to try to torque this make it to make it compliant? Because Margaret Atwood and Bev McLaughlin are
Yeah.
not people who are likely to speak out on this unless they look at it and they say there's a real problem with it, right?
Yeah.
So, but maybe they don't care. Like
Well,
maybe,
that's the kind of thing we see in election years too, which is we announce everything. We have kids' school programs and new houses, and we're going to save children from the internet. But by the time it rolls through the system, we've moved on.
yeah, sometimes I get a sense with some of the ministers, everybody's got a to-do list.
Hmm.
And, Online Harms Act, we need that. Varani took over from Heritage, right? And he
Yeah.
was named Undersecretary of Heritage so he could direct Heritage staff to deal with it, blah, 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 because they wanted to get this done because they said they were going to do it. And now they've done it and they can just check it off the list. If it dies in the courts, who cares? The minister got it done and off their list, and it'll take a couple of years or so before that happens. So they can just go into an election and saying, look, we did it. We're protecting children. these
Yeah.
people who are opposed to us, the only way your child is going to be safe is if you vote for us, right? Otherwise, these people are going to leave your children basically undefended, which is, of course, that's just the way politics works. So I actually, I don't think that, I think that's why they overstep. They just want to be able to say, we've done everything possible. And they're
And
not
then
really
reality will
paying,
kick in.
yeah, which is too bad. Because
We,
then we just end up back where we started.
yeah, where we started, we haven't wrestled the tough issues. I was just, this is, we have the luxury of these debates and talking about things like free speech when we can see others around the world who are dealing on a moment by moment basis with their lives in the balance. So it's, we get to have this. I was looking up some, well, just notes for this conversation. John Stuart Mill of the liberty of thought and discussion, but the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of opinion is that it is robbing the human race. If opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, a clearer perception and a livelier impression of truth produced by its collision of error. It'd be hard to top that as writing
Yes,
and thinking.
pretty smart guy, John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, about the future of free speech. Peter, always great to talk to you. Thank you very much. As we watch this unfold, we will back to you. You're very thoughtful. Your writing on this is always very helpful. So thanks so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's always fun to do something like this
Go back and forth. Peter
and speak
Menzies.
freely.
And speak freely. That's exactly right. Well, for now,
Yes.
senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute and the former vice chair of the CRTC. So when it comes to all these regulatory issues, he actually knows what he's talking about, and a long, long career in the newspaper business. So that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Smart People and Pamela Wallen. Thanks very much, Peter. We'll see you all soon.